Thank you, Becky. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jennifer Burns. I'm the current president of the Public Library section. Typically, author is in the evening with wine and cheese, but c'est la vie. So that's how it's going. So Dr. Lester Spence is a professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in the study of Black, racial, and urban politics in the wake of the neoliberal turn. He's an award-winning scholar. In 2013, he received the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award for his book, Stare into the Darkness, The Limits of Hip Hop and Black Politics. He can regularly be heard on National Public Radio in the Mark Steiner Show. So Lester, welcome and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer, for having me. Thanks, Becky, for your work. So first things first. So when we were setting this up, I think Becky told me that, listen, there's going to be all these, we're going to make sure that people aren't like seen in their cribs, like eating lunch or sipping on their Mai Tais or whatever. We're going to make sure. So all you're going to see is names. So I've been doing this lecture thing for a bit, but I have to say this is the first time where I'm just seeing names, and it's weird, but it's all good. So here's what I want to do. So first thing I want all of you to do, because I know there are a lot of you here, and I know that given the election, there are probably people of various political backgrounds. I want you to just sit and breathe just for a second. I imagine that for a big chunk of you, starting maybe as early as Sunday, but definitely into Monday, and then on Tuesday, a lot of you are feeling a great deal of anxiety. I know that in my case, both my graduate students and my undergraduate students, as well as a whole host of people in my community, were really nervous. So nervous that their brain was basically filling in that gap with all types of stories. And the one thing I had to tell my students, I teach on Mondays, and I told them, I said, listen, just remember, next Monday, we're still gonna be in class. Now, I didn't say that for the purpose of making sure that they did their work for next week. I did that rather to give them a sense that no matter what was gonna happen, the next Monday would still come, right? Monday was still coming. So I think we're almost at the end of at least this first process where we're gonna figure out who won one way or the other. The next process is gonna be challenging though. So with that, it's important that we kind of take a minute, breathe, remember how you felt at your most anxious. Maybe it was Monday, maybe it was Tuesday, and then remember kind of how you feel now as you breathe, right? Whatever the work that we have to do isn't gonna stop no matter what happens. So to that extent, what we really wanna do is center ourselves so we can be prepared for the work that's coming, all right? So here's what we're gonna do. Usually, like I think Becky said, we'd be doing this, I'd be with y'all, it'd be in the evening, I'd give you this talk, there'd be this long conversation afterwards, then we'd be drinking wine, sipping cheese, and probably moving on to harder stuff later, hopefully. But it's not that. So I don't have a lot of time. What I'm gonna do is try to take about a half hour or so to talk about our current political condition, connect social justice movements to that condition, and then connect libraries in general to this condition in two ways. One is talking about how the ways library function now is a product of a certain type of post-70s transition, and then the way social movements function both relies on libraries in a certain way, and in a certain way actually represents kind of a fight for libraries, all right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share the screen and go through a quick and dirty version of the talk that I usually give when I'm talking about my work. All right. So what you're looking at now is basically a screen that a slide that depicts inequality from about 1920 or so to about 2008. And actually, I think the figures, if we extended it, I think the figures now would be even a little bit higher. What we see are really high levels of inequality around 1930 or so, and really high levels now. In fact, there are higher levels of inequality now than there were during the Great Depression. And then there's this dip in the middle right now. Some folks would suggest that that dip just occurs kind of naturally as a function of economics. I actually argue that that dip was politically produced. And if you think about it, so after the Great Depression, people organized and actually forced President Roosevelt to forge what he called a New Deal. That New Deal had a few different elements. One, it enabled the power, the ability of labor to organize. Two, it created what we now know is Social Security, but then was old age insurance. Three, it actually created unemployment insurance. If you got cut from your job, certain types of jobs for reasons, you still be able to get paid. Four, it took a number of states had pension program for mothers who were married to people who died during World War I. They took that mother's pension program, basically nationalized it to create welfare. And then it created at least the rudiments of national health insurance, right? Then if you add on to that, the suite of policies created in the 50s and 60s that prevented discrimination on the basis of race and then eventually gender. And then you think about the Great Society programs that were designed to kind of make an intervention in poverty. That pretty much explains a big chunk of that dip, right? When you give labor the ability to organize, for example, they're able to get better wages, higher paying jobs. They're able to kind of create a better tax regime whereby taxes that are collected by some combination of local, state, and federal governments go directly to kind of regular everyday people. And it created kind of a challenging space. It wasn't a perfect space. Again, this is 1950, Black folk couldn't vote, but it was a space that was far more equitable than the one that preceded it. Right. But if you look around 1970 or so, you actually see this uptick. What explains that uptick? So really, really quickly, what you have in the early 1970s is two phenomena that aren't supposed to happen at the same time. One is really, really high levels of inflation. Two is really, really, really high levels of unemployment. They're not supposed to go together because inflation usually happens when you have all types of folk basically throwing money at the economy, and then that people raise the price of goods in response. In this case, you didn't have that because you have large numbers of people unemployed. So in that gap, that created a challenge, not just for society, but for theory, because what that moment signaled was that the theory that was used to problem solve the economy, the theory that in part was forged through the New Deal, was kind of sort of broken. So into that gap step a set of elites who articulate a new set of ideas about how the economy should function. Those sets of policies and kind of the human being that's developed as a result of that, I articulate, I use the phrase a neoliberal turn to describe the transition that encompasses those policies and that new human being. So the neoliberal turn is different from the era that precedes it in as much as the policies are as follows. Under the neoliberalism, you have a significant reduction in the ability of the government to collect taxes, particularly for progressive purposes. You have a significant reduction in the ability of labor to organize. You have a significant reduction in the scope and the scale of welfare policy. You have a significant increase in attempts to kind of privatize a range of public goods. And then you actually have alongside of, or as the welfare state kind of sort of diminishes in a certain way, we see a significant increase in the size of the carceral state, that bureaucracy basically designed to in prison segments of the population. And then even as it reduces the ability of labor to organize, it significantly increases capital mobility, both within the country and outside the country. Right now, I could talk a little bit more about that in the chat, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move to a few different ways we can see this play out, and then connect them to social justice movements, and then connect them to libraries, and then take questions. So if we look at productivity over time, right, there's this moment in time in which productivity rose as wages rose, right? So or rather wages rose as productivity rose. So as places like Ford were more productive in their ability to produce and sell cars, people who worked at Ford saw their wages increase. Around 1970 or so, we actually see a split where productivity increases, but wages basically flatline, right? So one way I think about this when I talk about this to folk is I just use the example of me being a professor, although the professor is a different type of gig, to be fair. What you have with me is there's this moment in time where so right after this, about a half hour after all this stuff starts, I have got a Zoom meeting with a student who's interested in writing better papers. Now, if the world were a 1970s world, then the only way she'd be able to get in touch with me would be office hours, or she would call me on the phone I have in the office. There'd be no other way she could get in touch with me. In this case, she actually sent me an email that I got through my phone, right? If I was working on a paper with a co-author, I would write the paper, send it to the co-author would make changes, then send it back to me. I'd make changes, send it back, right? Through the regular mail. In this case, you can actually work in real time. All that is basically represents productivity gains. Like, I can do far more work than I used to be able to do. In fact, my work hours really, if I had the capacity to stay up 24 hours, I'd have work 24 hours, right? But I'm not getting paid for that productivity. I'm getting paid about the same. So wages flatline. And a big chunk of that, even though I'm not in the union necessarily, a big chunk of that is because you've got a reduction in the ability of labor to organize. So real quickly, moving on, we've got a slide that basically shows you the size of the manufacturing sector. Again, places like Ford, and I give a shout out to Ford because that's where my dad worked, that's where my brother works. They used to offer really, really, really high wages. They used to offer stable, because of labor organizing, they were stable. It was hard to fire workers. And you didn't need a great deal of education. Both my brother and my dad are educated, but you could, back in the day in Detroit, you could get a job, a solid job providing for everybody in your family, and then providing for your grandkids even, with basically a high school education. As the ability of capital to move increases, we see manufacturing become less important. And instead comes the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. That's a sector that doesn't really produce goods per se. So that creates a challenge. It actually requires, to a certain extent, and valorizes a certain type of education. And it valorizes, and as much as it isn't organized labor-wise, it's further, as the sector goes, it kind of further reduces the power of labor. I'm gonna go back to the next slide is labor membership, union membership. So that's 2010. It's even lower now than it was then. And look, again, that 1970 point is really important because it's either then or a little bit after we see a significant dip in all this stuff. The ability of, if you look at welfare benefits over time, we see actually an increase around 1975 or so. There was this moment where you actually have people organizing for welfare rights, but as a certain set of ideas, and I'm going to come back again and again to ideas because it relates directly to what libraries do, as a certain set of ideas about welfare, about who is deserving, actually begin to take hold, and a set of ideas about the relationship between labor and the economy take hold, a new set of ideas, we actually see those benefits actually decrease. Again, this ends at 2007. It will be lower now. Talked about the rise of the carceral state. And a big chunk, we focus a lot on federal prisoners, but most of our prisoners are actually in state prisons. What we see is a relatively stable, if you look at incarceration rates, they're relatively stable, but they really begin to increase around the 1970 or so. And then they have a stark increase to the point now where we actually, even if we look, there's a racial component that I may get to, in as much as the prisoners are disproportionately Black and brown. But if we even just took the incarceration rate for white men, I think we would be number 3 or number 4 in the world as far as our incarceration. And then what else am I going to focus on? Is there another one? I think I'll focus on one more thing. And it's important to note. So the fundamental dynamic of this is that it not only creates inequality in general, it not only increases inequality between racial groups, it increases inequality within racial groups. That is, within Black communities, you have higher inequality levels than you've ever had before. In fact, it's higher in Black communities than it is between in anyone else in any other community, right? Let me stop sharing. You know what? No, I'll go a little bit further. And I want to talk a little bit about what this means for the city, right? So what this means for the city, for cities like Baltimore, cities like Detroit, and even smaller towns to a certain extent, is you actually see a significant increase in the degree to which the city and its goods are either privatized. So this is the Charm City circulator. This is actually a private means of transportation. The neighborhoods are gentrified. So what you see here is kind of an example of, is my kind of example of gentrification, where you have neighborhoods that once were home to a broad swath of the population. They end up significantly, they end up narrowing to the point where there are only certain types of people who are either high income earners or people who are creatives that are kind of welcome in these neighborhoods, with the idea being once you bring these people into these neighborhoods and these type of shops proliferate, then the number of, then the property values increase, more people move in. And then, that those benefits will kind of trickle down. Trickle down part never happens, or rarely happens. This represents kind of the growing, the rise of a certain type of development. So if you take a city like Brooklyn and you go back, maybe this is 2020, go back to around 1980, 1985 or so, you could find a house in those neighborhoods for probably like nice brownstones for probably maybe $40,000, $50,000. You could easily go shop at, there was this really nice working class mall, like in the middle of Brooklyn. But now what you see is a lot more of these. These are high-rise developments with condos that go at the low end in like the mid 6 figures. At the high end, you're talking about 7 figures, right? And that dynamic attends a certain type of carceral move, because though the people who live in those type of spaces don't want to necessarily be in the same space with working class folk, whatever their color, but particularly working class Black and brown folk. Finally, with the example of Amazon, I want to say last year, 2 years ago, Amazon made a pitch to relocate, to add a second headquarters outside of its Seattle headquarters. And they basically took pitches from cities, and cities threw all types of tax abatements at Amazon. In fact, I think in Newark, they gave Amazon so much in tax abatements and tax incentives that the state of New Jersey actually had to actually pass a law in order to make them, in order to allow for Newark to raise its cap on how much money to give them, right? Now, what's the general effect of these type of policies and this type of turn on something like the library, right? What we see in this moment is a few different types of moves. So one move is to take places like the library and to suggest that they should function more and more like businesses. Right. Now, some of this might be nomenclature, like maybe some the titles of some of the people who work in a library may actually change to reflect kind of a corporate logic. But in general, we see policy-wise, I'd imagine we see in libraries more of a turn to try to generate the type of goods that actually may quote unquote be profitable in a certain type of way. The way library functions are assessed, they are assessed using the logic of a business. Like I can imagine an increased use of kind of cost benefit analysis as it relates to the holdings of a library. You actually see more and more space in libraries probably taken up for business or business-like use. Perhaps in as far as programming, we see more programming that are designed to kind of shift people into economy or to talk about the economy or to talk about businesses. And then finally, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, I can see this manifesting in decreased support for the library as far as municipal spending and increased turn in libraries to donations. Whether it's individual donations or maybe it's like the creation of entities designed explicitly to get private money that can be poured into libraries. So in one way, and again, I could talk about this more in the chat, in one way, libraries are a core, the core function of libraries have actually changed in the result of as a result of the neoliberal term. So I'm going to hold that. Now, social justice movements. How do we see? I would suggest that we've got, over the past decade plus, there have been two movements that in many ways I suggest represent frontal assaults on the neoliberal term. So the first is Occupy Wall Street. So Occupy Wall Street is a movement that I think began maybe, I think it was around 2010, where you actually had occupations in cities all across the country, most prominent of which was Occupy Wall Street, which was in New York, but also prominent was the occupation in Oakland, the occupation in Baltimore, the occupation in Detroit. And what you have there is, for the first time, people in a generation plus, people were articulating the wealth gap as something that A, wasn't natural, B, did not reflect kind of natural differences in human capacity, C, wasn't good, and D, was actively evil and needed to be contested, right? So that's, although some would argue that because of the structure of the occupations, they were horizontal. They had a horizontal mode of leadership rather than a vertical one. And because they didn't have explicit policy or political asks, that after they dissolved, there was kind of a wrap. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we see the rise in something like the Democratic Socialists of America without Occupy Wall Street. We definitely don't see Bernie Sanders without Occupy Wall Street, to the extent to which Donald Trump himself, when he was running in 2016, actually spoke to economic inequality. That language actually is a byproduct of the work of Occupy Wall Street, right? So that's the first movement. Second movement is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter represents, there's an intraracial aspect of it, in as much as what Black Lives Matter does in Black communities is cause us to revisit who is and who isn't worthy of political care. But more broadly, what it actually does, it calls our attention to the growing role of the carceral state in America and the growing role police play in America's cities. So I talked about the carceral state. I just gave you one slide looking at the rise of state and federal prisoners over time. Another slide that I could have shown you is a slide charting the rise of police spending in places like Baltimore, right? Where we see, in some cases, 300, 400% rise in spending over time. Policing takes up more and more and more of a chunk out of municipal budgets. Even as cities feel as if they really can't spend on anything else, even they often find the time to spend money on policing. Now, what we've actually seen with it's funny because while Black Lives Matter, like Occupy Wall Street, it hasn't generated the type of policy shifts that that people suggest that a movement like that should generate. I'd suggest two things. One is when it's not over, it's actually ongoing, as recent protests over the murder of George Floyd, Jacob Blake, and Breonna Taylor, among others, attest to. But second, I would suggest that we can think of this broad attempt to kind of deal with America's racist, not just America, actually America's racist legacy and the legacy of colonialism more broadly, right? We can actually think about these policies or these kind of attempts to wrestle with that as a function of Black Lives Matter activism, and actually ends up filtering down even into an entity like the American Library Association, which I'm gonna try to get to in a second, right? So those two movements, I would suggest, represent a broad assault against the neoliberal turn. Occupy Wall Street is fighting against income inequality. Black Lives Matter is fighting against racial inequality, but also fighting against the role of policing, which is itself a byproduct of the neoliberal turn. Now, what role do libraries play in this? How do libraries, what role do they play? What role should they play? Now, I've already talked about the fact that libraries in a way actually represent, are actually kind of sort of shaped in a way. I actually want to say, no, I'll go ahead and say it, victimized in a way by the neoliberal term. So the libraries aren't distinct, right? But how actually I would suggest that libraries actually create the conditions under which entities like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter can exist. And then in a way, they represent what libraries are fighting for. Now, what do I mean when I say that libraries create the conditions whereby Occupy and Black Lives Matter can exist? I do not think it's a coincidence that one of the first things that the various Occupies created, and for those of you who don't know, you're talking about literal occupations, right? In Baltimore, for example, there was the occupation was in the Inner Harbor. In New York, the occupation was at, I think, Zuccotti Square, Zuccotti Park, and then it might have moved, but it actually started there. In these occupations, one of the first things people created were libraries. Why did they actually need libraries? They needed libraries, they created libraries, is because to a certain extent, while Occupy and Black Lives Matter both represent attempts to articulate a different set to get a different set of interests reflected in government, it also represents, more importantly, I think, an ideational move, right? So let's go back to that neoliberal turn, that 1970s moment, right? So what happened, and there are people who argue, with the route I'm taking, but I think this route is the right route. What happened in 1970 was an ideational crisis that in turn was solved by ideas, right? Now, there are all types of moments in time where institutions might matter more, like the apparatus we use to make decisions. There are all types of times where interests matter more, where like what we want determines what we do. And then there are instances in which our identities matter more, like who we are shapes everything, right? But if you've got an ideational crisis, your institutions, which were built on those old ideas, can't really help you. Your interests fail because you don't quite know what your interests are and what we should do. Who you are has no bearing. It may have some bearing, but who you are can't determine. What you need in an ideational crisis is new ideas. There is only one other entity, one other public entity in the state that actually helps to generate and seed ideas, right? There's the school, and then there's the library, right? It's the library that actually enables us to go back and find old ideas and repurpose them. It's the library that creates the space whereby we can actually take ideas, match them up against another, and then kind of find out, what the truth is, right? And then it's only in spaces, in as much as in cities, one of the core things that happens as a function of the neoliberal turn is public space itself is narrowed, right? The library represents one of the few community spaces left where we can actually have people kind of come together and talk about this, right? So I'd actually suggest that in as much as ideas like defund the police become important in Black Lives Matter, in as much as ideas like the 99% become important in Occupy, I suggest that it's the library as a broad concept that actually creates the space for these ideas, right? So that's one thing. I also suggest that in a way, in as much as these entities are kind of fighting, they're kind of fighting for the public good more broadly, but they're fighting for entities like the library in two specific ways, right? So in one way, they're fighting for libraries to be kind of spaces in which issues like racial inequality, economic inequality, and the two are linked. It's important that I reiterate that. In which these spaces are dealt with, right? They're fighting for a space in which these libraries can actually function for a broader and broader swath of society. So in a way, it's like libraries both create the conditions
that the former vice president has.
Roger Rise, I can hear you. Thank you. These two dynamics create the conditions for libraries to function in a way, but they're actually also produced by libraries in a certain type of way. Let me see. It is 11:35 now. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on Central Time. Why don't we do this? I could talk for another 10 minutes about this, but the thing is there aren't that many, particularly given the election, given what we're wrestling with. Yeah, what I'll do is I'll talk about one more thing and then I'll stop, right? So whatever happens with the election, we're basically in the middle of a cultural war over the nature of truth. I've lost 13 people over the past several months, all 13 of them due to COVID, directly or indirectly. One of the reasons why we've got 140,000 excess deaths is because we as a nation can't come to an agreement on what truth is and how truth functions. So if we think about the library as either producing movements around economic inequality or racial inequality. If we think about the library as either that or the library as kind of a certain byproduct of those movements, I think we actually end up missing perhaps the most important role libraries face in the context we're in. Where what I suggest, and here I'm literally thinking, like I'm thinking and talking out loud, I would actually suggest that libraries are basically ground zero, and I think the most important political movement that we can undertake. And that's the movement for truth itself. That's the movement for truth itself. We've got children, we've got adults, we've got senior citizens who don't know how to make truth claims, who if you actually push them on something that actually is a fact, that is not an opinion, that is a fact, in a number of cases, they wouldn't be able to tell you how to disprove a fact or to prove a fact. To that extent, I think what libraries are, they're not just a byproduct of social movements. They're not just an entity that creates the conditions for social movements. They represent ground zero for the ongoing social movement that we have to wage itself. On that note, it's 12:39 you guys' time. Why don't we stop there and take questions? Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everybody.
Thank you so much. So everybody, yeah, put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I'll read out a couple comments while we're waiting. Trudy from Onondaga, extreme postmodernism, as info has proliferated several times through various technological stream, truth starts to be harder to place for people.
Yeah. Yes, that's it. So we can think about it kind of as a set of ideas. So as the postmodern turn kind of infects the academy, and that spreads out, like it destabilizes it doesn't just destabilize capital T truth, and to a certain extent that's actually not a bad thing necessarily, but it destabilizes small t truth, right? Like I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about a fact of the election that could be verified, and the person I was having a conversation with just didn't have the means to kind of articulate for themselves what the truth with a small t was. You can also point to technological factors. You can talk to the rise of the internet. The internet has had it's challenging, but the internet to a certain extent has had a democratizing function, but in as much as is become incredibly tied to capital in one hand, and then actually it's more than one hand, but or more than two hands. It's tied to capital on one hand, and it's unmoored from standards on the other. It can be difficult to sift through all these competing claims. So to this extent, libraries serve a critical function going forward in helping to both kind of get people to assess various claims, and then also to kind of sort of bring people together. Now that last part is going to be difficult, because if you look at a map of 2016's election, if you look at a map of this election by county, not by state, what you see is we've got this huge, most states are all red except for the metropolitan area, right? Local libraries, given that, it can be difficult for libraries to bring different populations together, in as much as increasingly we're bifurcated spatially, but still the libraries are one of the only things we have, and it's the core function of the library to do that. And Becky, as an aside, could you do me a favor?
Yeah.
I imagine there's more than, if there are more than one question, take them. I want to take them in bulk, because the thing is,
Yeah.
is as y'all can imagine, I can go long, and I really want to get as much as I can.
Yep. So we had we have a let's see. We have a question right now. Should libraries buy books that taxpayers want, or ones that are correct? Real science, or what science deniers want to read? When does fact checking before we buy a book become censorship? We also had a comment question about libraries having programs and taxpayers, where is it? When we have programs that highlight issues about disinformation, and sometimes our taxpayers say we're pushing a political agenda, and that's not appropriate.
Yeah, so those are both two good comments. And in fact, there's something I'm gonna put a note to myself, and Becky, remind me if I don't get to it, because I want to, the ALA has actually taken a stance on issues of racial justice, and I want to come back to that, because I want to gently prod that stance they've taken, right? So once you individualize taxpaying, like one of the core ways the neoliberal turn actually, it was brilliant. What they did was they kind of individualized taxes and created kind of a taxpayer identity, in as much as people are now more attentive to where their individual money goes in certain ways, and then they're more attentive to kind of, they're more interested in kind of engaging in broader cost benefit analyses about whether they're getting the benefit for their money. Now, how that plays out in libraries is in a couple of different dynamics that you all just mentioned. In one case, for example, you've got the idea of actually taxpayers wanting certain types of books, or their library to have certain types of resources, where the library itself may actually want other resources, right? And there's a challenge there. And it's not an easy solution, but what I suggest is that libraries do have an obligation and responsibility to meet the needs of the denizens, of the people who live in the area. But the thing is you cannot solely, and in some cases, even primarily, use what they want to arbitrate what you actually deliver, right? Because while in some ways that ends up working, like when libraries started to have graphic novels and comic books in really large numbers, I imagine they got a lot more kids in them. And then once you have a kid in a library, they move from comic books to other stuff, right? That kind of sort of happened to me. So there is that. But at the same time, if we focus solely on this slice and focus solely on the needs and wants of citizens as they are now, then we actually miss this opportunity to actually expose them to a broader swath of resources, but B, to actually push for a certain type of truth claim, right? So to that extent, I understand the reluctance of librarians and of libraries to kind of engage in that in a certain way, because you are going to get the claim that you're engaging in politics. But the unfortunate reality is that we are in a political moment. So what's happening now is institutions and individuals are kind of sort of forced to either take a stance towards science and truth as a political move, or they're not.
We've also had a bunch of questions about the privatization of the internet and about interacting with social media algorithms. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so what we see among other things, I DJ. So I was buying some DJ equipment and, through the internet. And next thing I know, I see all these ads, like in my Facebook, in my email, on the Washington Post, all articulating this stuff, right? So that's one type of problematic way in which the internet's been privatized that has really, really problematic effects. The other way is that what you see is the increased use of algorithms to kind of beyond like consumer stuff, kind of like algorithms, like political algorithms to figure out what types of news sources people want to get access to. And what that does is that has a tendency to create these really crystallized social networks that create kind of that make it that reproduce certain types of problematic information that reproduce certain types of disinformation in ways that are deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. I think that one of the things libraries can do, but here it's not going to be libraries alone, is we actually need to make a deep, deep push to re-democratize the internet. And what that probably is going to involve is making moves against entities like Google, like Facebook, even entities like Apple, so as to actually reorient our relationship to information and to kind of not take economy out of it, but perhaps regulate information along public lines rather than private.
Are public intellectual spaces in jeopardy, e.g. public schools, public libraries, and speak to intellectual gentrification?
Are they? Oh, hell yes. That's easy. Hell yes. Can I say that here?
Yes, yes, you can.
Oh my God. Goodness gracious, they are. I mean, I believe in the public. I went to public schools. I was educated in public schools. I don't necessarily work in one now. Hopkins is a private school, but I still think of Hopkins as having a public mission. I fight for that public mission within an institution every day, right? And we have to, again, it's really unfortunate. We have to commit to it. We have to basically commit to fighting this fight for the rest of our lives. Not just, oh, we'll just leave the babies, let the kids do it. No, we're gonna have to fight this the rest of our lives.
And then just a little bit of what you spoke to before, but we have a lot in the chat about lots of librarians and libraries often hear that, I'm a taxpayer and I pay your salary. And
yes.
Yes.
That's part of the same groove, right? What you have to do is you have to ticket. So tax paying isn't about me paying you, as you being the government, to give me what I want. Taxes are paid to provide for public services, right? It's supposed to provide for the public good. So yeah, taxpayer A can say what they want about I pay your salary, yes, and that works. And to be fair, like with policing, for example, like I can easily see that being used to discipline police officers, right? But police officers and librarians are two different entities. Like police use their power, use the power they have to, they're the only entity allowed to use given the ability to use deadly force domestically. Any vehicle you can use to discipline them up to and including individual taxpayer claims, you should do so. But it's a different groove when you're talking about librarians. Librarians are kind of the keepers of the flame. So to that extent, it's not about one individual taxpayer. It's about the broader public good. The broader public good is bigger than any individual taxpayer. It should be bigger than any individual taxpayer, particularly given this moment.
Yeah. And then we have, how should we instruct our patrons to research the truth using the internet or books in print/online when they all have Google? All they have to do is Google information, which may or may not be factual.
So you know what? So one of the things I want to point to. So I remember my daughter played lacrosse in high school, and she was on a state team. So she was at the state team for practice, and I had some work to do. So I went to a local library, and I saw the dopest thing. Somebody in a suburban Maryland library actually had created like a movie. It was a film series. And the movie they were showing was Blue Collar. Blue Collar is a late 70s movie starring Richard Pryor, Harvey Keitel, and Yaphet Kotto, among other people. And it's basically about union organizing. It's about union organizing, about working class life, and it's all in the wrappings of basically a heist flick, political corruption. And I emailed the guy, I emailed the librarian, I'm like, and it was part of a suite of movies like that. I was like, wow, this is dope. How did you come up with this idea? He was like, you know what? I just thought that given the time, it might be worth to actually expose citizens to kind of, to create the conditions where we could just talk. And movies like this can kind of sort of serve a number of different purposes. What I'd suggest is that one of the things libraries can do is actually begin to have those type of programs where it is about figuring out how to sift, how to determine what the truth is or from what isn't, like Disinformation 101, for example. Like I can imagine doing that with lecturers. I can imagine doing that with movies. I can imagine doing that with music. There are a number of different ways I can imagine doing that, but I think that's of critical importance. And note that that's different than an individual coming up to you and you going back to that individual and saying, okay, yes, this is how you do it, right? I'm talking about something broader where you're actually using the space and bringing people together. And now it's complicated because of COVID, but even with COVID, I would suggest, like right now I'm speaking to 170 people approximately, right? I imagine that you can actually do the same type of dynamic virtually, and there's a big need for it.
I think we have time for...
It's 11:54, so I really wanted to get at the that American Library Association issue. And as an aside, my name is Lester Spence. You can Google me. I'll actually try to really quickly put in the chat my my first book, which is actually you don't even have to pay for it. It's like free. So let me see if I can pull it up real quick.
Lester, you can email me the link and I can post it on this presentation right here and people can access it as well. Oh,
awesome. Yes, please do that. And then I'm just pasting it in the chat. So one of the things that we're doing, we're becoming a lot more sensitive to racial justice issues, right? And the ALA actually has a number of different pieces on how to kind of deal with whiteness in the library, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff I think is critically important, right? But the one dynamic that there are a few dynamics it doesn't get at. One dynamic is, I think to the extent, so I think libraries diversifying are incredibly important. We need works by a whole range of authors. We need works that depict a whole range of subjects, right? What we have to do in doing that is understand that you don't just do that for the benefit of people who have been discriminated against. You actually do that for the people who are quote unquote in power, and I put that in quotes, right? Like I grew up going to libraries. I read I read The Lord of the Rings before I was out of second grade. I read the Chronicles of Narnia in third grade, Dark is Rising, first grade, Judy Blume books, fourth and fifth grade. I don't remember when the first time, to be frank, that I actually read a fiction book featuring Black characters, right? But I saw Black people every day, right? Like my mom, I've got beautiful Black people all around me. So it edified me to finally read stories about Black folk. But it seemed to me that the people who really needed to be exposed to stories about Black folk were white folk. It wasn't really Black folk. So that's one thing that we have to really articulate. And you do the same thing around gender, do the same thing around sexuality. The other thing that it does is it articulates racism as either a matter of individual level dynamics where the whites in this audience have either explicit or implicit biases that shape their behavior, or to the extent that it looks at structural racism, it actually articulates structural racism as things like perhaps how many people are hired in a library system, how many folk of color are hired within a library system, and what maybe the security apparatus is within libraries. That is important, that's incredibly important. But I think that is of importance to articulate alongside of that is this kind of broader public claim I'm making about the resources that libraries have. If you think about libraries and the types of resources they have, and you distinguish them by their community, we find that some communities have disproportionately more resources than others, right? The libraries that have disproportionately less resources are likely in communities that are more Black and brown, but they're also in communities that are poor. So if we're not connecting that structural racism dynamic to this broader class dynamic, what we're going to do is we're going to miss not just an opportunity to bring different communities that have the same economic interest together, but we're going to actually end up missing the responsibility libraries have to actually make, libraries have broadly to make sure that all libraries have the type of resources they need to kind of educate and provide public goods for their citizens. And that is as much an issue of poverty as it is an issue of racism. So I can, just 2 minutes, if there's nothing else, I really am honored to be here. I just want to give a shout out again to Jennifer Burns, important work she's doing. Give a shout out to Becky Chernobyl. I want to give a shout out to the librarians really quickly. And this kind of shows you how complicated all this stuff is. The first people in my life to call me professor were not my students, but were the white librarians at my working class, poor elementary school in Inkster, Michigan. And then after that, the same term was used by the white librarians in Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn, Michigan was at one point in time the most racist city in Michigan. It was so racist that it actually closed its libraries to folks who weren't Dearborn citizens, meaning they closed their libraries to Black people. It's there that I actually got the whole little professor idea, right? So I want to give a shout out to librarians, because I don't think I would be here if it, in a really, really fundamental way, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the love of reading inculcated in me by my parents, and then the love of reading that was then inculcated and spread and kind of germinated in a way by librarians. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For the chat on our conference platform is just filled with the thank yous, excellent, super engaging, just all thank yous, so many applause emojis. So thank you so much. And again, this presentation is recorded and it will be posted at a later date. So awesome, incredible talk. Thank you. So yeah, again, thank you so much for taking your time out of your very busy schedule and travel schedule to talk with us today.
You're very welcome. Hopefully we can do this with liquor and wine soon.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Thank you, Lester.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Our next session is at 2 o'clock. So grab some lunch if you haven't already, and we'll see you back around 2. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.